Part 1. 1. The great fish moved silently through the night water, propelled by short sweeps of its crescent tail. The mouth was open just enough to permit a rush of water over the gills. There was little other motion, an occasional correction of the apparently aimless course by the slight raising or lowering of a pectoral fin, as a bird changes direction by dipping one wing and lifting the other. The eyes were sightless in the black, and the other senses transmitted nothing extraordinary to the small, primitive brain. The fish might have been asleep, save for the movement dictated by countless millions of years of instinctive continuity. Lacking the flotation bladder common to other fish, and the fluttering flaps to push oxygen-bearing water through its gills, it survived only by moving. Once stopped, it would sink to the bottom and die of anoxia. The land seemed almost as dark as the water, for there was no moon. All that separated sea from shore was a long, straight stretch of beach, so white that it shone. From a house behind the grass-splotched dunes, lights cast yellow glimmers on the sand. The front door to the house opened, and a man and a woman stepped out onto the wooden porch. They stood for a moment staring at the sea, embraced quickly, and scampered down the few steps onto the sand. The man was drunk, and he stumbled on the bottom step. The woman laughed and took his hand, and together they ran to the beach. "First a swim," said the woman, "to clear your head." "Forget my head," said the man. Giggling, he fell backward onto the sand, pulling the woman down with him. They fumbled with each other's clothing, twined limbs around limbs, and thrashed with urgent ardor on the cold sand. Afterward, the man lay back and closed his eyes. The woman looked at him and smiled. "Now how about that swim?" she said. "You go ahead. I'll wait for you here." The woman rose and walked to where the gentle surf washed over her ankles. The water was colder than the night air, for it was only mid-June. The woman called back, "You're sure you don't want to come?" But there was no answer from the sleeping man. She backed up a few steps, then ran at the water. At first her strides were long and graceful, but then a small wave crashed into her knees. She faltered, regained her footing, and flung herself over the next waist-high wave. The water was only up to her hips, so she stood, pushed the hair out of her eyes, and continued walking until the water covered her shoulders. There she began to swim, with the jerky head-above-water stroke of the untutored. 100 yards offshore, the fish sensed a change in the sea's rhythm. It did not see the woman, nor yet did it smell her. Running within the length of its body were a series of thin canals, filled with mucus and dotted with nerve endings, and these nerves detected vibrations and signaled the brain. The fish turned toward shore. The woman continued to swim away from the beach, stopping now and then to check her position by the lights shining from the house. The tide was slack, so she had not moved up or down the beach. But she was tiring, so she rested for a moment, treading water, and then started for shore. The vibrations were stronger now, and the fish recognized prey. The sweeps of its tail quickened, thrusting the giant body forward with a speed that agitated the tiny phosphorescent animals in the water and caused them to glow, casting a mantle of sparks over the fish. The fish closed on the woman and hurtled past, a dozen feet to the side and 6 feet below the surface. The woman felt only a wave of pressure that seemed to lift her up in the water and ease her down again. She stopped swimming and held her breath. Feeling nothing further, she resumed her lurching stroke. The fish smelled her now, and the vibrations, erratic and sharp, signaled distress. The fish began to circle close to the surface. Its dorsal fin broke water, and its tail, thrashing back and forth, cut the glassy surface with a hiss. A series of tremors shook its body. For the first time the woman felt fear, though she did not know why. Adrenaline shot through her trunk and her limbs, generating a tingling heat and urging her to swim faster. She guessed that she was 50 yards from shore. She could see the line of white foam where the waves broke on the beach. She saw the lights in the house, and for a comforting moment she thought she saw someone pass by one of the windows. The fish was about 40 feet away from the woman, off to the side, when it turned suddenly to the left, dropped entirely below the surface, and with 2 quick thrusts of its tail was upon her. At first, the woman thought she had snagged her leg on a rock or a piece of floating wood. There was no initial pain, only one violent tug on her right leg. She reached down to touch her foot, treading water with her left leg to keep her head up, feeling in the blackness with her left hand. She could not find her foot. She reached higher on her leg, and then she was overcome by a rush of nausea and dizziness. Her groping fingers had found a nub of bone and tattered flesh. She knew that the warm, pulsing flow over her fingers in the chill water was her own blood. Pain and panic struck together. The woman threw her head back and screamed a guttural cry of terror. The fish had moved away. It swallowed the woman's limb without chewing. Bones and meat passed down the massive gullet in a single spasm. Now the fish turned again, homing on the stream of blood flushing from the woman's femoral artery, a beacon as clear and true as a lighthouse on a cloudless night. This time the fish attacked from below. It hurtled up under the woman, jaws agape. The great conical head struck her like a locomotive, knocking her up out of the water. The jaws snapped shut around her torso, crushing bones and flesh and organs into a jelly. The fish, with the woman's body in its mouth, smashed down on the water with a thunderous splash, spewing foam and blood and phosphorescence in a gaudy shower. Below the surface, the fish shook its head from side to side, its serrated triangular teeth sawing through what little sinews still resisted. The corpse fell apart. The fish swallowed, then turned to continue feeding. Its brain still registered the signals of nearby prey. The water was laced with blood and shreds of flesh, and the fish could not sort signal from substance. It cut back and forth through the dissipating cloud of blood, opening and closing its mouth, seining for a random morsel. But by now most of the pieces of the corpse had dispersed. A few sank slowly, coming to rest on the sandy bottom, where they moved lazily in the current. A few drifted away just below the surface, floating in the surge that ended in the surf. The man awoke, shivering in the early morning cold. His mouth was sticky and dry, and his wakening belch tasted of bourbon and corn. The sun had not yet risen, but a line of pink on the eastern horizon told him that daybreak was near. The stars still hung faintly in the lightening sky. The man stood and began to dress. He was annoyed that the woman had not woken him when she went back to the house, and he found it curious that she had left her clothes on the beach. He picked them up and walked to the house. He tiptoed across the porch and gently opened the screen door, remembering that it screeched when yanked. The living room was dark and empty, littered with half-empty glasses, ashtrays, and dirty plates. He walked across the living room, turned right down a hall, past 2 closed doors. The door to the room he shared with the woman was open, and a bedside light was on. Both beds were made. He tossed the woman's clothes on one of the beds, then returned to the living room and switched on a light. Both couches were empty. There were 2 more bedrooms in the house. The owners slept in one. 2 other house guests occupied the other. As quietly as possible, the man opened the door to the first bedroom. There were 2 beds, each obviously containing only one person. He closed the door and moved to the next room. The host and hostess were asleep on each side of a king-size bed. The man closed the door and went back to his room to find his watch. It was nearly 5. He sat on one bed and stared at the bundle of clothes on the other. He was certain the woman wasn't in the house. There had been no other guests for dinner, so unless she had met someone on the beach while he slept, she couldn't have gone off with anyone. And even if she had, he thought, she probably would have taken at least some of her clothes. Only then did he permit his mind to consider the possibility of an accident. Very quickly the possibility became a certainty. He returned to the host's bedroom, hesitated for a moment beside the bed, and then softly placed his hand on a shoulder. "Jack," he said, patting the shoulder. "Hey, Jack." The man sighed and opened his eyes. "What?" "It's me, Tom. I hate like hell to wake you up, but I think we may have a problem." "What problem?" "Have you seen Chrissy?" "What do you mean, have I seen Chrissy? She's with you." "No, she isn't. I mean, I can't find her." Jack sat up and turned on a light. His wife stirred and covered her head with a sheet. Jack looked at his watch. "Jesus Christ! It's 5 in the morning, and you can't find your date." "I know," said Tom. "I'm sorry. Do you remember when you saw her last?" "Sure I remember. She said you were going for a swim and you both went out on the porch. When did you see her last?" "On the beach. Then I fell asleep." "You mean she didn't come back?" "Not that I saw. At least not before we went to bed, and that was around 1. "I found her clothes." "Where? On the beach?" "Yes." "You looked in the living room?" Tom nodded. "And in the Henkel's room." "The Henkel's room?" Tom blushed. "I haven't known her that long. For all I know, she could be a little weird. So could the Henkels. I mean, I'm not suggesting anything. I just wanted to check the whole house before I woke you up." "So what do you think?" "What I'm beginning to think," said Tom, "is that maybe she had an accident. Maybe she drowned." Jack looked at him for a moment, then glanced again at his watch. "I don't know what time the police in this town go to work," he said, "but I guess this is as good a time as any to find out." 2. Patrolman Len Hendricks sat at his desk in the Amity police station reading a detective novel called Deadly I'm Yours. At the moment the phone rang, the heroine, a girl named Whistling Dixie, was about to be raped by a motorcycle club. Hendricks let the phone ring until Miss Dixie castrated the first of her attackers with a linoleum knife she had secreted in her hair. He picked up the phone. "Amity Police, Patrolman Hendricks," he said. "Can I help you?" "This is Jack Foote, over on Old Mill Road. I want to report a missing person, or at least I think she's missing." "Say again, sir?" Hendricks had served in Vietnam as a radio man, and he was fond of military terminology. "One of my house guests went for a swim at about 1 this morning," said Foote. "She hasn't come back yet. Her date found her clothes on the beach." Hendricks began to scribble on a pad. "What was the person's name?" "Christine Watkins." "Age?" "I don't know. Just a second. Say around 25. Her date says that's about right." "Height and weight?" "Wait a minute." There was a pause. "We think probably about 5'7", between 120 and 130. Color of hair and eyes?" "Listen, officer, why do you need all this? If the woman's drowned, she's probably going to be the only one you have. At least tonight, right? You don't average more than 1 drowning around here each night, do you?" "Who said she drowned, Mr. Foote? Maybe she went for a walk." "Stark naked at 1 in the morning? Have you had any reports about a woman walking around naked?" Hendricks relished the chance to be insufferably cool. "No, Mr. Foote, not yet. But once the summer season starts, you never know what to expect. Last August, a bunch of faggots staged a dance out by the club. A nude dance. Color of hair and eyes?" "Her hair is, dirty blonde, I guess. Sandy. I don't know what color her eyes are. I'll have to ask her date." No, he says he doesn't know either. Let's say Hazel. Okay, Mr. Foote, we'll get on it. As soon as we find out anything, we'll contact you. Hendricks hung up the phone and looked at his watch. It was 5:10. The chief wouldn't be up for an hour, and Hendricks wasn't anxious to wake him for something as vague as a missing person report. For all anybody knew, the broad was off humping in the bushes with some guy she met on the beach. On the other hand, if she was washed up somewhere, Chief Brody would want the whole thing taken care of before the body was found by some nanny with a couple of young kids and it became a public nuisance. Judgment. That's what the chief kept telling him he needed. That's what makes a good cop. And the cerebral challenge of police work had played a part in Hendricks' decision to join the Amity force after he returned from Vietnam. The pay was fair. $9,000 to start, $15,000 after 15 years, plus fringes. Police work offered security, regular hours, and the chance for some fun. Not just thumping unruly kids or collaring drunks, but solving burglaries, trying to catch the occasional rapist. The summer before, a black gardener had raped 7 rich white women, not one of whom would appear in court to testify against him. And on a slightly more elevated plane, the opportunity to become a respected, contributing member of the community. And being an Amity cop was not very dangerous. Certainly nothing like working for a metropolitan force. The last duty-related fatality of an Amity policeman occurred in 1957, when an officer had tried to stop a drunk speeding along the Montauk Highway and had been run off the road into a stone wall. Hendricks was convinced that as soon as he could get sprung from this godforsaken midnight to 8 shift, he would start to enjoy his work. For the time being, though, it was a drag. He knew perfectly well why he had the late shift. Chief Brody liked to break in his young men slowly, letting them develop the fundamentals of police work, good sense, sound judgment, tolerance, and politeness, at a time of day when they wouldn't be overtaxed. The business shift was 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and it called for experience and diplomacy. 6 men worked that shift. 1 handled the summertime traffic at the intersection of Main and Water Streets. 2 patrolled in squad cars. 1 manned the phones at the station house. 1 handled the clerical work. And the chief handled the public. The ladies who complained that they were unable to sleep because of the din coming from the Randy Bear or Saxons, the town's 2 gin mills. The homeowners who complained that bums were littering the beaches or disturbing the peace. And the vacationing bankers and brokers and lawyers who stopped in to discuss their various plans for keeping Amity a pristine and exclusive summer colony. 4 to midnight was the trouble shift, when the young studs from the Hamptons would flock to the Randy Bear and get involved in a fight, or simply get so drunk that they became a menace on the roads. When very rarely a couple of predators from Queens would lurk in the dark side streets and mug passers-by. And when about twice a month in the summer, enough evidence having accumulated, the police would feel obliged to stage a pot bust at one of the huge waterfront homes. There were 6 men on 4 to midnight, the 6 largest men on the force, all between 30 and 50 years old. Midnight to 8 was usually quiet. For 9 months of the year, peace was virtually guaranteed. The biggest event of the previous winter had been an electrical storm that had set off all the alarms linking the police station to 48 of Amity's biggest and most expensive homes. Normally, during the summer, the midnight to 8 shift was manned by 3 officers. One, however, a young fellow named Dick Angelo, was now taking his 2-week leave before the season began to swing. The other was a 30-year veteran named Henry Kimball, who had chosen the midnight to 8 shift because it permitted him to catch up on his sleep. He held a daytime job as a bartender at Saxon's. Hendricks tried to raise Kimball on the radio to get him to take a walk along the beach by Old Mill Road, but he knew the attempt was hopeless. As usual, Kimball was sound asleep in a squad car parked behind the Amity Pharmacy. And so Hendricks picked up the phone and dialed Chief Brody's home number. Brody was asleep, in that fitful state before waking when dreams rapidly change and there are moments of bleary semi-consciousness. The first ring of the phone was assimilated into his dream, a vision that he was back in high school groping a girl on a stairwell. The second ring snapped the vision. He rolled over and picked up the receiver. "Yeah?" "Chief, this is Hendricks. I hate to bother you this early, but—" "What time is it?" 5:20. "Leonard, this better be good." "I think we've got a floater on our hands, Chief." "A floater? What in Christ's name is a floater?" It was a word Hendricks had picked up from his night reading. "A drowning," he said, embarrassed. He told Brody about the phone call from Foote. "I didn't know if you'd want to check it out before people start swimming. I mean, it looks like it's going to be a nice day." Brody heaved an exaggerated sigh. "Where's Kimball?" he said, and then added quickly, "Oh, never mind. It was a stupid question. One of these days I'm going to fix that radio of his so he can't turn it off." Hendricks waited a moment, then said, "Like I said, Chief, I hate to bother—" "Yeah, I know, Leonard. You were right to call. As long as I'm awake, I might as well get up. I'll shave and shower and grab some coffee, and on my way in I'll take a look along the beach in front of Old Mill and Scotch, just to make sure your floater isn't cluttering up somebody's beach. Then when the day boys come on, I'll go out and talk to Foote and the girl's date. I'll see you later." Brody hung up the phone and stretched. He looked at his wife, lying next to him in the double bed. She had stirred when the phone rang, but as soon as she determined that there was no emergency, she lapsed back into sleep. Ellen Brody was 36, 5 years younger than her husband, and the fact that she looked barely 30 was a source of both pride and annoyance to Brody. Pride because, since she looked handsome and young and was married to him, she made him seem a man of excellent taste and substantial attraction. Annoyance because she had been able to keep her good looks despite the strains of bearing 3 children, whereas Brody, though hardly fat at 6'1" and 200 pounds, was beginning to be concerned about his blood pressure and his thickening middle. Sometimes, during the summer, Brody would catch himself gazing with idle lust at one of the young, long-legged girls who pranced around town, their untethered breasts bouncing beneath the thinnest of cotton jerseys. But he never enjoyed the sensation, for it always made him wonder whether Ellen felt the same stirring when she looked at the tanned, slim young men who so perfectly complemented the long-legged girls. And as soon as that thought occurred to him, he felt still worse, for he recognized it as a sign that he was on the unfortunate side of 40 and had already lived more than half his life. Summers were bad times for Ellen Brody, for in summer she was tortured by thoughts she didn't want to think, thoughts of chances missed and lives that could have been. She saw people she had grown up with, prep school classmates now married to bankers and brokers, summering in Amity and wintering in New York, graceful women who stroked tennis balls and enlivened conversations with equal ease, women who, Ellen was convinced, joked among themselves about Ellen Shepard marrying that policeman because he got her pregnant in the back seat of his 1948 Ford, which had not been the case. Ellen was 21 when she met Brody. She had just finished her junior year at Wellesley and was spending the summer in Amity with her parents, as she had done for the previous 11 summers, ever since her father's advertising agency transferred him from Los Angeles to New York. Although, unlike several of her friends, Ellen Shepard was hardly obsessed by marriage. She assumed that within a year or two after finishing college, she would wed someone from approximately her own social and financial station. The thought neither distressed nor delighted her. She enjoyed the modest wealth her father had earned, and she knew her mother did too. But she was not eager to live a life that was a repetition of her parents'. She was familiar with the petty social problems, and they bored her. She considered herself a simple girl, proud of the fact that in the yearbook for the class of 1953 at Miss Porter's school, she was voted most sincere. Her first contact with Brody was professional. She was arrested, or rather, her date was. It was late at night, and she was being driven home by an extremely drunk young man intent on driving very fast down very narrow streets. The car was intercepted and stopped by a policeman who impressed Ellen with his youth, his looks, and his civility. After issuing a summons, he confiscated the keys to Ellen's date's car and drove them both to their respective homes. The next morning, Ellen was shopping when she found herself next to the police station. As a lark, she walked in and asked the name of the young officer who had been working at about midnight the night before. Then she went home and wrote Brody a thank you note for being so nice, and she also wrote a note to the chief of police commending young Martin Brody. Brody telephoned to thank her for her thank you note. When he asked her out to dinner and the movies on his night off, she accepted out of curiosity. She had scarcely ever talked to a policeman, let alone gone out with one. Brody was nervous, but Ellen seemed so genuinely interested in him and his work that he eventually calmed down enough to have a good time. Ellen found him delightful, strong, simple, kind, sincere. He had been a policeman for 6 years. He said his ambition was to be chief of the Amity force, to have sons to take duck shooting in the fall, to save enough money to take a real vacation every second or third year. They were married that November. Ellen's parents had wanted her to finish college, and Brody had been willing to wait until the following summer. But Ellen couldn't imagine that one more year of college could make any difference in the life she had chosen to lead. There were some awkward moments during the first few years. Ellen's friends would ask them to dinner or lunch or for a swim, and they would go. But Brody would feel ill at ease and patronized. When they got together with Brody's friends, Ellen's past seemed to stifle fun. People behaved as if they were fearful of committing a faux pas. Gradually, as friendships developed, the awkwardness disappeared. But they never saw any of Ellen's old friends anymore. Although the shedding of the summer people's stigma earned her the affection of the year-round residents of Amity, it cost her much that was pleasant and familiar from the first 21 years of her life. It was as if she had moved to another country. Until about 4 years ago, the estrangement hadn't bothered her. She was too busy and too happy raising children to let her mind linger on alternatives long past. But when her last child started school, she found herself adrift, and she began to dwell on memories of how her mother had lived her life once her children had begun to detach from her. Shopping excursions, fun because there was enough money to buy all but the most outrageously expensive items, long lunches with friends, tennis, cocktail parties, weekend trips. What had once seemed shallow and tedious now loomed in memory like paradise. At first, she tried to re-establish bonds with friends she hadn't seen in 10 years, but all commonality of interest and experience had long since vanished. Ellen talked gaily about the community, about local politics, about her job as a volunteer at the Southampton Hospital, all subjects about which her old friends, many of whom had been coming to Amity every summer for more than 30 years, knew little and cared less. They talked about New York politics, about art galleries and painters and writers they knew. Most conversations ended with feeble reminiscences and speculations about where old friends were now. Always there were pledges about calling each other and getting together again. Once in a while she would try to make new friends among the summer people she hadn't known. But the associations were forced and brief. They might have endured if Ellen had been less self-conscious about her house, about her husband's job and how poorly it paid. She made sure that everyone she met knew she had started her amity life on an entirely different plane. She was aware of what she was doing, and she hated herself for it, because, in fact, she loved her husband deeply, adored her children, and, for most of the year, was quite content with her lot. By now, she had largely given up active forays into the summer community, but the resentments and the longings lingered. She was unhappy, and she took out most of her unhappiness on her husband, a fact that both of them understood but only he could tolerate. She wished she could go into suspended animation for that quarter of every year. Brody rolled over toward Ellen, raising himself up on one elbow and resting his head on his hand. With his other hand, he flicked away a strand of hair that was tickling Ellen's nose and making it twitch. He still had an erection from the remnants of his last dream, and he debated rousing her for a quick bit of sex. He knew she was a slow waker, and her early morning moods were more cantankerous than romantic. Still, it would be fun. There had not been much sex in the Brody household recently. There seldom was when Ellen was in her summer moods. Just then, Ellen's mouth fell open and she began to snore. Brody felt himself turn off as quickly as if someone had poured ice water on his loins. He got up and went into the bathroom. It was nearly 6:30 when Brody turned onto Old Mill Road. The sun was well up. It had lost its daybreak red and was turning from orange to bright yellow. The sky was cloudless. Theoretically, there was a statutory right-of-way between each house to permit public access to the beach, which could be privately owned only to the mean high water mark. But the rights-of-way between most houses were filled with garages or privet hedges. From the road there was no view of the beach. All Brody could see was the tops of the dunes. So every 100 yards or so he had to stop the squad car and walk up a driveway to reach a point from which he could survey the beach. There was no sign of a body. All he saw on the broad white expanse was a few pieces of driftwood, a can or two, and a yard-wide belt of seaweed and kelp pushed ashore by the southerly breeze. There was practically no surf, so if a body was floating on the surface, it would have been visible. If there is a floater out there, Brody thought, it's floating beneath the surface and I'll never see it till it washes up. By 7 o'clock, Brody had covered the whole beach along Old Mill and Scotch Roads. The only thing he had seen that struck him as even remotely odd was a paper plate on which sat 3 scalloped orange rinds, a sign that the summer's beach picnics were going to be more elegant than ever. He drove back along Scotch Road, turned north toward town on Bayberry Lane, and arrived at the station house at 7:10. Hendricks was finishing up his paperwork when Brody walked in, and he looked disappointed that Brody wasn't dragging a corpse behind him. "No luck, Chief?" he said. "That depends on what you mean by luck, Leonard. If you mean did I find a body, and if I didn't, isn't it too bad, the answer to both questions is no. Is Kimball in yet?" "No." "Well, I hope he isn't asleep. That'd look just dandy, having him snoring away in a cop car when people start to do their shopping." "He'll be here by 8, said Hendricks. "He always is." Brody poured himself a cup of coffee, walked into his office, and began to flip through the morning papers. The early edition of the New York Daily News and the local paper, the Amity Leader, which came out weekly in the winter and daily in the summer. Kimball arrived a little before 8, looking, aptly enough, as if he had been sleeping in his uniform, and he had a cup of coffee with Hendricks while they waited for the day shift to appear. Hendricks' replacement came in at 8 sharp, and Hendricks was putting on his leather flight jacket and getting ready to leave when Brody came out of his office. "I'm going out to see Foot, Leonard," Brody said. "You want to come along? You don't have to, but I thought you might want to follow up on your floater." Brody smiled. "Sure, I guess so," said Hendricks. "I got nothing else going today, so I can sleep all afternoon." They drove out in Brody's car. As they pulled into Foot's driveway, Hendricks said. "What do you bet they're all asleep? I remember last summer a woman called at 1 in the morning and asked if I could come out as early as possible the next morning because she thought some of her jewelry was missing. I offered to go right then, but she said no, she was going to bed. Anyway, I showed up at 10 o'clock the next morning and she threw me out. I didn't mean this early," she says.
"We'll see," said Brody. "If they're really worried about this dame, they'll be awake."
The door opened almost before Brody had finished knocking.
"We've been waiting to hear from you," said a young man. "I'm Tom Cassidy. Did you find her?"
"I'm Chief Brody. This is Officer Hendricks. No, Mr. Cassidy, we didn't find her. Can we come in?"
"Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Go on in the living room. I'll get the foots."
It took less than 5 minutes for Brody to learn everything he felt he needed to know. Then, as much to seem thorough as from any hope of learning anything useful, he asked to see the missing woman's clothes. He was shown into the bedroom, and he looked through the clothing on the bed.
"She didn't have a bathing suit with her?"
"No," said Cassidy. "It's in the top drawer over there. I looked." Brody paused for a moment, taking care with his words, then said,
"Mr. Cassidy, I don't mean to sound flip or anything, but has this Miss Watkins got a habit of doing strange things? I mean, like taking off in the middle of the night, or walking around naked?"
"Not that I know of," said Cassidy, "but I really don't know her too well."
"I see," said Brody. "Then I guess we'd better go down to the beach again. You don't have to come. Hendricks and I can handle it."
"I'd like to come if you don't mind."
"I don't mind. I just thought you might not want to."
The 3 men walked down to the beach. Cassidy showed the policeman where he had fallen asleep. The indentation his body had made in the sand had not been disturbed, and he pointed out where he had found the woman's clothes. Brody looked up and down the beach. For as far as he could see, more than a mile in both directions, the beach was empty. Clumps of seaweed were the only dark spots on the white sand. "Let's take a walk," he said. "Leonard, you go east as far as the point. Mr. Cassidy, let's you and I go west. You got your whistle, Leonard, just in case?" "I've got it," said Hendricks. "You care if I take my shoes off? It's easier walking on the hard sand. I don't want to get them wet."
"I don't care," said Brody. "Technically, you're off duty. You can take your pants off if you want. Of course, then I'll arrest you for indecent exposure."
Hendricks started eastward. The wet sand felt crisp and cool on his feet. He walked with his head down and his hands in his pockets, looking at the tiny shells and tangles of seaweed. A few bugs, they looked like little black beetles, skittered out of his path, and when the wave wash receded, he saw minute bubbles pop above the holes made by sandworms. He enjoyed the walk. It was a funny thing, he thought, that when you live all your life in a place, you almost never do the things that tourists go there to do, like walk on the beach or go swimming in the ocean. He couldn't remember the last time he went swimming. He wasn't even sure he still owned a bathing suit. It was like something he had heard about New York, that half the people who live in the city never go to the top of the Empire State Building or visit the Statue of Liberty. Every now and then, Hendricks looked up to see how much closer he was to the point. Once he turned back to see if Brody and Cassidy had found anything. He guessed that they were nearly half a mile away. As he turned back and started walking again, Hendricks saw something ahead of him, a clump of weed and kelp that seemed unusually large. He was about 30 yards away from the clump when he began to think the weed might be clinging to something. When he reached the clump, Hendricks bent down to pull some of the weed away. Suddenly he stopped. For a few seconds he stared, frozen rigid. He fumbled in his pants pocket for his whistle, put it to his lips, and tried to blow. Instead, he vomited, staggered back, and fell to his knees. Snarled within the clump of weed was a woman's head, still attached to shoulders, part of an arm, and about a third of her trunk. The mass of tattered flesh was a mottled blue-gray, and as Hendricks spilled his guts into the sand, he thought, and the thought made him retch again, that the woman's remaining breast looked as flat as a flower pressed in a memory book. "Wait," said Brody, stopping and touching Cassidy's arm. "I think that was a whistle." He listened, squinting into the morning sun. He saw a black spot on the sand, which he assumed was Hendricks, and then he heard the whistle more clearly. "Come on," he said, and the two men began to trot along the sand. Hendricks was still on his knees when they got to him. He had stopped puking, but his head still hung mouth open, and his breathing rattled with phlegm. Brody was several steps ahead of Cassidy, and he said, "Mr. Cassidy, stay back there a second, will you?" He pulled apart some of the weeds, and when he saw what was inside, he felt bile rise in his throat. He swallowed and closed his eyes. After a moment, he said, "You might as well look now, Mr. Cassidy, and tell me if it's her or not." Cassidy was terrified. His eyes shifted between the exhausted Hendricks and the mass of weed. "That?" he said, pointing at the weed. Reflexively, he stepped backward. "That thing? What do you mean it's her?" Brody was still fighting to control his stomach. "I think," he said, "that it may be part of her." Reluctantly, Cassidy shuffled forward. Brody held back a piece of weed so Cassidy could get a clear look at the gray and gaping face. "Oh, my God!" said Cassidy, and he put a hand to his mouth. "Is it her?" Cassidy nodded, still staring at the face. Then he turned away and said, "What happened to her?" "I can't be sure," said Brody. "Offhand, I'd say she was attacked by a shark." Cassidy's knees buckled, and as he sank to the sand, he said, "I think I'm going to be sick." He put his head down and retched. The stink of vomit reached Brody almost instantly, and he knew he had lost his struggle. "Join the crowd," he said, and he vomited too. 3. Several minutes passed before Brody felt well enough to stand, walk back to his car, and call for an ambulance from the Southampton hospital. And it was almost an hour before the ambulance arrived, and the truncated corpse was stuffed into a rubber bag and hauled away. By 11 o'clock, Brody was back in his office, filling out forms about the accident. He had completed everything but cause of death when the phone rang. "Carl Santos, Martin," said the voice of the coroner. "Yeah, Carl. What have you got for me?" "Unless you have any reason to suspect a murder, I'd have to say shark." "Murder?" said Brody. "I'm not suggesting anything. All I mean is that it's conceivable, just barely, that some nut could have done this job on the girl with an axe and a saw." "I don't think it's a murder, Carl. I've got no motive, no murder weapons, and unless I want to go off into left field, no suspect." "Then it's a shark, and a big bastard, too. Even the screw on an ocean liner wouldn't have done this. It might have cut her in two, but—" "Okay, Carl," said Brody. "Spare me the gore. My stomach's none too hot already." "Sorry, Martin. Anyway, I'm going to put down shark attack. I'd say that makes the most sense for you, too, unless there are, other considerations." "No," said Brody. "Not this time. Thanks for calling, Carl." He hung up, typed shark attack in the cause of death space on the forms, and leaned back in his chair. The possibility that other considerations might be involved in this case hadn't occurred to Brody. Those considerations were the touchiest part of Brody's job, forcing him constantly to assess the best means of protecting the common weal without compromising either himself or the law. It was the beginning of the summer season, and Brody knew that on the success or failure of those 12 brief weeks rested the fortunes of amity for a whole year. A rich season meant prosperity enough to carry the town through the lean winter. The winter population of Amity was about 1,000. In a good summer, the population jumped to nearly 10,000. And those 9,000 summer visitors kept the 1,000 permanent residents alive for the whole year. Merchants, from the owners of the hardware store and the sporting goods store and the 2 gas stations to the local pharmacist, needed a boom summer to support them through the winter, during which they never broke even. The wives of carpenters, electricians, and plumbers worked during the summer as waitresses or real estate agents to help keep their families going over the winter. There were only 2 year-round liquor licenses in Amity, so the 12 weeks of summer were critical to most of the restaurants and pubs. Charter fishermen needed every break they could get. Good weather, good fishing, and above all, crowds. Even after the best of summers, Amity winters were rough. 3 of every 10 families went on relief. Dozens of men were forced to move for the winter to the north shore of Long Island, where they scratched for work shucking scallops for a few dollars a day. Brody knew that one bad summer would nearly double the relief rolls. If every house was not rented, there wouldn't be enough work for Amity's blacks, most of whom were gardeners, butlers, bartenders, and maids. And 2 or 3 bad summers in a row, a circumstance that fortunately hadn't occurred in more than 2 decades, could create a cycle that could wreck the town. If people didn't have enough money to buy clothes or gas or ample food supplies, if they couldn't afford to have their houses or their appliances repaired, then the merchants and service firms would fail to make enough to tide them over until the next summer. They would close down, and Amity's citizens would start shopping elsewhere. The town would lose tax revenue. Municipal services would deteriorate, and people would begin to move away. So there was a common, though tacit understanding in Amity, born of the need to survive. Everyone was expected to do his bit to make sure that Amity remained a desirable summer community. A few years ago, Brody remembered, a young man and his brother had moved into town and set themselves up as carpenters. They came in the spring, when there was enough work preparing houses for summer residents to keep everyone busy, so they were welcomed. They seemed competent enough, and several established carpenters began to refer work to them. But by midsummer, there were disquieting reports about the Felix brothers. Albert Morris, the owner of Amity Hardware, let it be known that they were buying cheap steel nails instead of galvanized nails and were charging their customers for galvanized. In a seaside climate, steel nails begin to rust in a few months. Dick Spitzer, who ran the lumber yard, told somebody that the Felixes had ordered a load of low-grade green wood to use in some cabinets in a house on Scotch Road. The cabinet doors began to warp soon after they were installed. In a bar one night, the elder Felix, Armando, boasted to a drinking buddy that on his current job he was being paid to set supporting studs every 16 inches, but was actually placing them 24 inches apart. And the younger Felix, a 21-year-old named Danny with a stubborn case of acne, liked to show his friends erotic books which he bragged he had stolen from the houses he worked in. Other carpenters stopped referring work to the Felixes, but by then they had built enough of a business to keep them going through the winter. Very quietly, the Amity understanding began to work. At first, there were just a few hints to the Felixes that they had outworn their welcome. Armando reacted arrogantly. Soon, annoying little mishaps began to bother him. All the tires on his truck would mysteriously empty themselves of air, and when he called for help from the Amity Gulf station, he was told that the air pump was broken. When he ran out of propane gas in his kitchen, the local gas company took 8 days to deliver a new tank. His orders for lumber and other supplies were inexplicably mislaid or delayed. In stores where once he had been able to obtain credit, he was now forced to pay cash.
By the end of October, the Felix brothers were unable to function as a business and they moved away. Generally, Brody's contribution to the Amity understanding, in addition to maintaining the rule of law and sound judgment in the town, consisted of suppressing rumors and, in consultation with Harry Meadows, the editor of the Amity Leader, keeping a certain perspective on the rare unfortunate occurrences that qualified as news. The previous summer's rapes had been reported in the Leader, but just barely, as molestations, because Brody and Meadows agreed that the specter of a black rapist stalking every female in Amity wouldn't do much for the tourist trade. In that case, there was the added problem that none of the women who had told the police they had been raped would repeat their stories to anyone else. If one of the wealthier summer residents of Amity was arrested for drunken driving, Brody was willing, on a first offense, to book him for driving without a license, and that charge would be duly reported in the Leader. But Brody made sure to warn the driver that the second time he was caught driving under the influence he would be charged, booked, and prosecuted for drunk driving. Brody's relationship with Meadows was based on a delicate balance. When groups of youngsters came to town from the Hamptons and caused trouble, Meadows was handed every fact, names, ages, and charges lodged. When Amity's own youth made too much noise at a party, the Leader usually ran a one-paragraph story without names or addresses, informing the public that the police had been called to quell a minor disturbance on, say, Old Mill Road. Because several summer residents found it fun to subscribe to the Leader year-round, the matter of wintertime vandalism of summer houses was particularly sensitive. For years, Meadows had ignored it, leaving it to Brody to make sure that the homeowner was notified, the offenders punished, and the appropriate repairmen dispatched to the house. But in the winter of 1968, 16 houses were vandalized within a few weeks. Brody and Meadows agreed that the time had come for a full campaign in the Leader against wintertime vandals. The result was the wiring of the 48 homes to the police station, which, since the public didn't know which houses were wired and which weren't, all but eliminated vandalism, made Brody's job much easier, and gave Meadows the image of a crusading editor. Once in a while, Brody and Meadows collided. Meadows was a zealot against the use of narcotics. He was also a man with unusually keen repertorial antennae, and when he sensed a story, one not susceptible to other considerations, he would go after it like a pig after truffles. In the summer of 1971, the daughter of one of Amity's richest families had died off the Scotch Road beach. To Brody, there was no evidence of foul play, and since the family opposed an autopsy, the death was officially listed as drowning. But Meadows had reason to believe that the girl was on drugs, and that she was being supplied by the son of a Polish potato farmer. It took Meadows almost 2 months to get the story, but in the end he forced an autopsy which proved that at the time she drowned, the girl had been unconscious from an overdose of heroin. He also tracked down the pusher and exposed a fairly large drug ring operating in the Amity area. The story reflected badly on Amity and worse on Brody, who, because several federal violations were involved in the case, wasn't even able to redeem his earlier insouciance by making an arrest or two. And it won Meadows 2 regional journalism prizes. Now it was Brody's turn to press for full disclosure. He intended to close the beaches for a couple of days, to give the shark time to travel far from the Amity shoreline. He didn't know whether or not sharks could acquire a taste for human flesh, as he had heard tigers do, but he was determined to deprive the fish of any more people. This time he wanted publicity to make people fear the water and stay away from it. Brody knew there would be a strong argument against publicizing the attack. Like the rest of the country, Amity was still feeling the effects of the recession. So far, the summer was shaping up as a mediocre one.
Rentals were up from last year, but they were not good rentals. Many were groupers, bands of 10 or 15 young people who came from the city and split the rent on a big house. At least a dozen of the $7,000 to $10,000 a season shorefront houses had not yet been rented, and many more in the $5,000 class were still without leases. Sensational reports of a shark attack might turn mediocrity into disaster. Still, Brody thought, one death in mid-June before the crowds come would probably be quickly forgotten. Certainly it would have less effect than 2 or 3 more deaths would. The fish might well have disappeared already, but Brody wasn't willing to gamble lives on the possibility. The odds might be good, but the stakes were prohibitively high. He dialed Meadows' number. "Hey, Harry," he said. "Free for lunch?"
"I've been wondering when you'd call," said Meadows. "Sure. My place or yours?"
Suddenly, Brody wished he hadn't called at mealtime. His stomach was still groaning, and the thought of food nauseated him. He glanced up at the wall calendar. It was a Thursday. Like all their friends on fixed, tight incomes, the Brodys shopped according to the supermarket specials. Monday's special was chicken, Tuesday's lamb, and so forth through the week. As each item was consumed, Ellen would note it on her list and replace it the next week. The only variables were bluefish and bass, which were inserted in the menu when a friendly fisherman dropped his overage by the house. Thursday's special was hamburger, and Brody had seen enough chopped meat for one day. "Yours," he said. "Why don't we order out from Size? We can eat in your office."
"Fine with me," said Meadows. "What do you want? I'll order now."
"Egg salad, I guess, and a glass of milk."
"I'll be right there."
Brody called Ellen to tell her he wouldn't be home for lunch. Harry Meadows was an immense man, for whom the act of drawing breath was exertion enough to cause perspiration to dot his forehead. He was in his late 40s, ate too much, chain-smoked cheap cigars, drank bonded bourbon, and was, in the words of his doctor, the Western world's leading candidate for a huge coronary infarction. When Brody arrived, Meadows was standing beside his desk, waving a towel at the open window.
"In deference to what your lunch order tells me is a tender stomach," he said, "I am trying to clear the air of essence of white owl."
"I appreciate that," said Brody. He glanced around the small, cluttered room, searching for a place to sit.
"Just throw that crap off the chair there," Meadows said. "They're just government reports. Reports from the county, reports from the state, reports from the Highway Commission and the Water Commission. They probably cost about $1 million, and from an informational point of view, they don't amount to a cup of spit."
Brody picked up the heap of papers and piled them atop a radiator. He pulled the chair next to Meadows' desk and sat down. Meadows rooted around in a large brown paper bag, pulled out a plastic cup and a cellophane-wrapped sandwich, and slid them across the desk to Brody. Then he began to unwrap his own lunch, 4 separate packages which he opened and spread before himself with the loving care of a jeweler showing off rare gems. A meatball hero, oozing tomato sauce, a plastic carton filled with oily fried potatoes, a dill pickle the size of a small squash, and a quarter of a lemon meringue pie. He reached behind his chair and from a small refrigerator withdrew a 16-ounce can of beer.
"Delightful,"
he said with a smile as he surveyed the feast before him.
"Amazing,"
said Brody, stifling an acid belch. "Abso-fucking-lutely amazing. I must have had about 1,000 meals with you, Harry, but I still can't get used to it."
"Everyone has his little quirks, my friend," Meadows said as he lifted his sandwich. "Some people chase other people's wives. Some lose themselves in whiskey. I find my solace in nature's own nourishment." That'll be some solace to Dorothy when your heart says, "That's enough, Buster, adios." "We've discussed that, Dorothy and I," said Meadows, filtering the words through a mouthful of bread and meat. "And we agree that one of the few advantages man has over other animals is the ability to choose the way to bring on his own death. Food may well kill me, but it's also what has made life such a pleasure. Besides, I'd rather go my way than end up in the belly of a shark. After this morning, I'm sure you'll agree." Brody was in the midst of swallowing a bite of egg salad sandwich, and he had to force it past a rising gag. "Don't do that to me," he said. They ate in silence for a few moments. Brody finished his sandwich and milk, wadded the sandwich wrapper, and stuffed it into the plastic cup. He leaned back and lit a cigarette. Meadows was still eating, but Brody knew his appetite wouldn't be diminished by any discussion. He recalled a time when Meadows had visited the scene of a bloody automobile accident and proceeded to interview police and survivors while sucking on a coconut popsicle. "About the Watkins thing," Brody said. "I have a couple of thoughts if you want to hear them." Meadows nodded. "First, it seems to me that the cause of death is cut and dried. I've already talked to Santos, and—" "I did too." "So you know what he thinks. It was a shark attack, clear and simple. And if you'd seen the body, you'd agree. There's just no—" "I did see it." Brody was astonished, mostly because he couldn't imagine how anyone who had seen that mess could be sitting there now licking lemon pie filling off his fingers. "So you agree?" "Yes, I agree that's what killed her. But there are a few things I'm not so sure of." "Like what?" "Like why she was swimming at that time of night. Do you know what the temperature was at around midnight? 60. Do you know what the water temperature was? About 50. You'd have to be out of your mind to go swimming under those conditions." "Or drunk," said Brody, "which she probably was." "Maybe. No, you're right. Probably. I've checked around a little, and the Foots don't mess with grass or mescaline or any of that stuff. There's one other thing that bothers me, though." Brody was annoyed. "For Christ's sake, Harry, stop chasing shadows. Once in a while people do die by accident." "It's not that. It's just that it's damn funny that we've got a shark around here when the water's still this cold." "Is it? Maybe there are sharks who like cold water. Who knows about sharks?" "There are some. There's the Greenland shark, but they never come down this far, and even if they did, they don't usually bother people. Who knows about sharks? I'll tell you this. At the moment, I know a hell of a lot more about them than I did this morning. After I saw what was left of Miss Watkins, I called a young guy I know up at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. I described the body to him, and he said it's likely that only one kind of shark would do a job like that." "What kind?" "A great white. There are others that attack people, like tigers and hammerheads, and maybe even makos and blues. But this fellow Hooper, Matt Hooper, told me that to cut a woman in half like that, you'd have to have a fish with a mouth like this." He spread his hands about 3 feet apart. "And the only shark that grows that big and attacks people is the great white. There's another name for them." "Oh?" Brody was beginning to lose interest. "What's that?" "Man-eater. Other sharks kill people once in a while for all sorts of reasons. Hunger, maybe, or confusion, or because they smell blood in the water. By the way, did the Watkins girl have her period last night?" "How the hell would I know?" "Just curious. Hooper said that's one way to guarantee yourself an attack if there's a shark around." "What did he say about the cold water?" "That it's quite common for a great white to come into water this cold. Some years ago, a boy was killed by one near San Francisco. The water temperature was 57. Brody sucked a long drag from his cigarette and said, You've really done a lot of checking into this, Harry. It seemed to me a matter of, shall we say, common sense and public interest to determine exactly what happened and the chances of it happening again. And did you determine those chances? I did. They're almost non-existent. From what I can gather, this was a real freak accident. According to Hooper, the only thing good about great whites is that they're scarce. There's every reason to believe that the shark that attacked the Watkins girl is long gone. There are no reefs around here. There's no fish processing plant or slaughterhouse that dumps blood or guts into the water. So there's nothing at all to keep the shark interested. Meadows paused and looked at Brody, who returned his gaze silently. So it seems to me, Martin, that there's no reason to get the public all upset over something that's almost sure not to happen again. That's one way to look at it, Harry. Another is that since it's not likely to happen again, there's no harm in telling people that it did happen this once. Meadows sighed. Journalistically, you may be right. But I think this is one of those times, Martin, when we have to forget the book and think of what's best for the people. I don't think it would be in the public interest to spread this around. I'm not thinking about the townspeople. They'll know about it soon enough, the ones that don't know already. But what about the people who read the leader in New York or Philadelphia or Cleveland? You flatter yourself. Balls. You know what I mean. And you know what the real estate situation is like around here this summer. We're right on the edge, and other places are too, like Nantucket and the Vineyard and East Hampton. There are people who still haven't made their summer plans. They know they've got their pick-up places this year. There's no shortage of houses for rent. Anywhere. If I run a story saying that a young woman was bitten in two by a monster shark off Amity, there won't be another house rented in this town. Sharks are like axe murderers, Martin. People react to them with their guts. There's something crazy and evil and uncontrollable about them. If we tell people there's a killer shark around here, we can kiss the summer goodbye. Brody nodded. I can't argue with that, Harry, and I don't want to tell the people that there is a killer shark around here. Look at it from my point of view, just for a second. I won't dispute your odds or anything. You're probably right. That shark has probably gone 100 miles from here and won't ever show up again. The most dangerous thing out there in the water is probably the undertow. But Harry, there's a chance you're wrong, and I don't think we can take that chance. Just suppose we don't say a word and somebody else gets hit by that fish. What then? My ass is in a sling. I'm supposed to protect people around here, and if I can't protect them from something, the least I can do is warn them that there is a danger. Your ass is in a sling, too. You're supposed to report the news, and there's just no question but that someone killed by a shark is news. I want you to run the story, Harry. I want to close the beaches just for a couple of days, and just for insurance sake. It won't be a great inconvenience to anybody. There aren't that many people here yet, and the water's cold. If we tell it straight, tell people what happened and why we're doing what we're doing, I think we'll be way ahead. Meadows sat back in his chair and thought for a moment. I can't speak for your job, Martin, but as far as mine is concerned, the decision has already been made. What does that mean? There won't be any story about the attack and the leader. Just like that. Well, not exactly. It wasn't entirely my decision, though I think that generally I agree with it. I'm the editor of this paper, Martin, and I own a piece of it, but not a big enough piece to buck certain pressures. Such as? I've gotten 6 phone calls already this morning. 5 were from advertisers. 1 restaurant, 1 hotel, 2 real estate firms, and an ice cream shop. They were most anxious to know whether or not I planned to run a story on the Watkins thing, and most anxious to let me know they felt Amity would best be served by letting the whole thing fade quietly away. The 6th call was from Mr. Coleman in New York. Mr. Coleman, who owns 55% of the Leader. It seems Mr. Coleman had received a few phone calls himself. He told me there would be no story in the Leader. I don't suppose he said whether the fact that his wife is a real estate broker had anything to do with his decision. No, said Meadows. The subject never came up. Figures. Well, Harry, where does that leave us? You're not going to run a story, so as far as the good readers of the Leader are concerned, nothing ever happened. I'm going to close the beaches and put up a few signs saying why. Okay, Martin. That's your decision. But let me remind you of something. You're an elected official, right? Just like the president, for 4 thrill-filled years. Elected officials can be impeached. Is that a threat, Harry? Meadows smiled. You know better than that. Besides, who am I to be making threats? I just want you to be aware of what you're doing before you tinker with the lifeblood of all those sage and discriminating souls who elected you.
Brody rose to go. Thanks, Harry. I've always heard it's lonely here at the top. What do I owe you for lunch?
Forget it. I couldn't take money from a man whose family will soon be begging for food stamps.
Brody laughed. No way. Haven't you heard? The great thing about police work is the security. 10 minutes after Brody returned to his office, the intercom buzzer sounded and a voice announced, "The mayor's here to see you, Chief." Brody smiled. The mayor. Not Larry Vaughn, just calling to check in. Not Lawrence Vaughn of Vaughn and Penrose Real Estate, stopping by to complain about some noisy tenants. But Mayor Lawrence P. Vaughn, the people's choice, by 71 votes in the last election. Send His Honor in, Brody said. Larry Vaughn was a handsome man in his early 50s, with a full head of salt and pepper hair and a body kept trim by exercise. Though he was a native of Amity, over the years he had developed an air of understated chic. He had made a great deal of money in post-war real estate speculation in Amity, and he was the senior partner, some thought the only partner since no one had ever met or spoken to anyone named Penrose in Vaughn's office, in the most successful agency in town. He dressed with elegant simplicity in timeless British jackets, button-down shirts, and Ouijan loafers. Unlike Ellen Brody, who had descended from summer folk to winter folk and was unable to make the adjustment, Vaughn had ascended smoothly from winter folk to summer folk, adjusting each step of the way with grace. He was not one of them, for he was technically a local merchant, so he was never asked to visit them in New York or Palm Beach. But in Amity he moved freely among all but the most aloof members of the summer community, which, of course, did an immense amount of good for his business. He was asked to most of the important summer parties, and he always arrived alone. Very few of his friends knew that he had a wife at home, a simple, adoring woman who spent much of her time doing needlepoint in front of her television set. Brody liked Vaughn. He didn't see much of him during the summer, but after Labor Day, when things calmed down, Vaughn felt free to shed some of his social scales, and every few weeks he and his wife would ask Brody and Ellen out to dinner at one of the better restaurants in the Hamptons. The evenings were special treats for Ellen, and that in itself was enough to make Brody happy. Vaughn seemed to understand Ellen. He always acted most graciously, treating Ellen as a clubmate and comrade. Vaughn walked into Brody's office and sat down. "I just talked to Harry Meadows," he said. Vaughn was obviously upset, which interested Brody. He hadn't expected this reaction. "I see," he said. "Harry doesn't waste any time." "Where are you going to get the authority to close the beaches?" "Are you asking me as the mayor, or as a real estate broker, or out of friendly interest, or what, Larry?" Vaughn pressed, and Brody could see he was having trouble controlling his temper. I want to know where you're going to get the authority. I want to know now."
"Officially, I'm not sure I have it," Brody said. "There's something in the code that says I can take whatever actions I deem necessary in the event of an emergency. But I think the selectmen have to declare a state of emergency. I don't imagine you want to go through all that rigmarole."
"Not a chance."
"Well then, unofficially, I figure it's my responsibility to keep the people who live here as safe as I can. And at the moment, it's my judgment that that means closing the beaches for a couple of days. If it ever came down to cases, I'm not sure I could arrest anyone for going swimming. Unless," Brody smiled, "I could make a case of criminal stupidity."
Vaughn ignored the remark. "I don't want you to close the beaches," he said.
"So I see."
"You know why. The 4th of July isn't far off, and that's the make-or-break weekend. We'd be cutting our own throats."
"I know the argument, and I'm sure you know my reasons for wanting to close the beaches. It's not as if I have anything to gain."
"No. I'd say quite the opposite is true. Look, Martin, this town doesn't need that kind of publicity."
"It doesn't need any more people killed either."
"Nobody else is going to get killed, for God's sake. All you'd be doing by closing the beaches is inviting a lot of reporters to come snooping around where they don't have any business."
"So? They'd come out here, and when they didn't find anything worth reporting, they'd go home again. I don't imagine the New York Times has much interest in covering a lodge picnic or a garden club supper."
"We just don't need it. Suppose they did find something. There'd be a big to-do that couldn't do anybody any good."
"Like what, Larry? What could they find out? I don't have anything to hide. Do you?"
"No, of course not. I was just thinking about maybe the rapes. Something unsavory."
"Crap," said Brody. "That's all past history."
"Damn it, Martin!"
Vaughn paused for a moment, struggling to calm himself.
"Look, if you won't listen to reason, would you listen to me as a friend? I'm under a lot of pressure from my partners. Something like this could be very bad for us."
Brody laughed. "That's the first time I've heard you admit you had partners, Larry. I thought you ran that shop like an emperor."
Vaughn was embarrassed, as if he felt he had said too much. "My business is very complicated," he said. "There are times I'm not sure I understand what's going on. Do me this favor, this once."
Brody looked at Vaughn, trying to fathom his motives. "I'm sorry, Larry. I can't. I wouldn't be doing my job."
"If you don't listen to me," said Vaughn, "you may not have your job much longer."
"You haven't got any control over me. You can't fire any cop in this town."
"Not off the force, no. But believe it or not, I do have discretion over the job of chief of police."
"I don't believe it."
From his jacket pocket, Vaughn took a copy of the corporate charter of the town of Amity. "You can read it yourself," he said, flipping through until he found the page he sought. "It's right here." He handed the pamphlet across the desk to Brody. "What it says, in effect, is that even though you were elected to the chief's job by the people, the selectmen have the power to remove you."
Brody read the paragraph Vaughn had indicated. "I guess you're right," he said, "but I'd love to see what you put down for good and sufficient cause."
"I dearly hope it doesn't come to that, Martin. I had hoped this conversation wouldn't even get this far. I had hoped that you would go along, once you knew how I and the selectmen felt."
"All the selectmen?"
"A majority."
"Like who?"
"I'm not going to sit here and name names for you. I don't have to. All you have to know is that I have the board behind me, and if you won't do what's right, we'll put someone in your job who will." Brody had never seen Vaughn in a mood so aggressively ugly. He was fascinated, but he was also slightly shaken.
"You really want this, don't you, Larry?"
"I do." Sensing victory, Vaughn said evenly, "Trust me, Martin. You won't be sorry."
Brody sighed. "Shit," he said. "I don't like it. It doesn't smell good. But okay, if it's that important."
"It's that important." For the first time since he had arrived, Vaughn smiled. "Thanks, Martin," he said, and he stood up. "Now I have the rather unpleasant task of visiting the Foots."
"How are you going to keep them from shooting off their mouths to the Times or the news?"
"I hope to be able to appeal to their public spiritedness," Vaughn said, "just as I appealed to yours."
Bull.
"We do have one thing going for us. Miss Watkins was a nobody. She was a drifter, no family, no close friends. She said she had hitchhiked east from Idaho, so she won't be missed." Brody arrived home a little before 5. His stomach had settled down enough to permit him a beer or two before dinner. Ellen was in the kitchen, still dressed in the pink uniform of a hospital volunteer. Her hands were immersed in chopped meat, kneading it into a meatloaf. "Hello," she said, turning her head so Brody could plant a kiss on her cheek. "What was the crisis?"
"You were at the hospital. You didn't hear?"
"No. Today was Bathe the Old Ladies' Day. I never got off the Ferguson wing."
"A girl got killed off Old Mill."
"By what?"
"A shark."
Brody reached into the refrigerator and found a beer. Ellen stopped kneading meat and looked at him. "A shark? I've never heard of that around here. You see one once in a while, but they never do anything."
"Yeah, I know. It's a first for me, too."
"So what are you going to do?"
"Nothing."
"Really? Is that sensible? I mean, isn't there anything you can do?"
"Sure, there are some things I could do, technically, but there's nothing I can actually do. What you and I think doesn't carry much weight around here. The powers that be are worried that it won't look nice if we get all excited just because one stranger got killed by a fish. They're willing to take the chance that it was just a freak accident that won't happen again. Or rather, they're willing to let me take the chance, since it's my responsibility."
"What do you mean, the powers that be?"
"Larry Vaughn, for one."
"Oh, I didn't realize you had talked to Larry."
"He came to see me as soon as he heard I planned to close the beaches. He wasn't what you'd call subtle about telling me he didn't want the beaches closed. He said he'd have my job if I did close them."
"I can't believe that, Martin. Larry isn't like that."
"I didn't think so either. Hey, by the way, what do you know about his partners?"
"In the business? I didn't think there were any. I thought Penrose was his middle name or something like that. Anyway, I thought he owned the whole thing."
"So did I, but apparently not."
"Well, it makes me feel better to know you talked to Larry before you made any decision. He tends to take a wider, more overall view of things than most people. He probably does know what's best."
Brody felt the blood rise in his neck. He said simply, "Crap."
Then he tore the metal tab off his beer can, flipped it into the garbage can, and walked into the living room to turn on the evening news. From the kitchen, Ellen called, "I forgot to tell you. You had a call a little while ago."
"Who from?"
"He didn't say. He just said to tell you you're doing a terrific job. It was nice of him to call, don't you think?"